Hello, and thanks for joining us for this episode of Into the Killing. Today's episode is going to be slightly different than our other episodes. We're going to be doing 3 mini episodes, so it's more like our videos on our YouTube channel, Criminally Listed. If you like this episode, then you should check out Criminally Listed. Tiffany, we're looking in your direction. We also have another YouTube channel called Paranormally Listed, where we feature cases about the supernatural, otherworldly, and anything mysterious. For this first segment, we're going back to July 1992. In July 1992, Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar was serving a 5-year sentence in a prison he designed himself called La Catedral. The personal prison overlooked Medellin, Colombia. The jail had a soccer field, pool, jacuzzi, and bar, among other amenities. Escobar picked the men who would guard him. The personal prison was part of an unusual agreement that Escobar struck with the Colombian government. Instead of being extradited to the United States, Escobar would serve his sentence there. But the government revoked the deal in July 1992 because they discovered Escobar was still conducting his illegal business. The government didn't mind the drug trafficking, but he had 4 of his men tortured and murdered in the prison. So on July 22, 1992, after serving about 13 months, they were going to move him to a military prison. When the army surrounded La Catedral, Escobar and several of his men escaped. During the construction, Escobar had a hidden tunnel constructed and he escaped through it. He then went into hiding. After his escape, his cartel fell apart. 16 months after he escaped, in December 1993, a day after his 44th birthday, Pablo Escobar was gunned down by the Colombian National Police. On July 6, 1992, the #1 song was the incredibly infectious hip-hop song Baby Got Back by Sir Mix-a-Lot. The #1 movie was Batman Returns. Alameda is in the East Bay area of California. In the early 90s, it had a population of about 76,000. In July 1992, it was home to 25-year-old Juliette Rivera. She lived alone in an apartment. She was an East Coast transplant. She was born on July 4th, 1967, in Brooklyn, New York. Juliette had 3 brothers. She worked as a legal secretary across the bay in San Francisco. She was well liked at her office, where she had been working for 2 years. In early July, her coworkers threw her a birthday party. On the evening of July 6, 2 days after her 25th birthday, Juliette went out to 2 bars. The next day, she did not show up for work or call the office to let them know that she wasn't coming in. This was very out of character for her because she was a responsible employee. Her boss called the police and reported her missing. The police went to her apartment and found nothing to be amiss. The police told the media that there were no signs of foul play. But everyone who knew her suspected something happened because it was very unlike her to disappear and not to communicate with any of her friends or family. On July 18, 1992, about a week and a half after 25-year-old Juliette Rivera went missing, a farmer found her dead body near an irrigation pond in rural San Mateo County. An autopsy was performed and it was determined she had been beaten to death. She was struck on the back of the head and the left side of the head with a flat object. The police never found the murder weapon, nor did they publicly speculate what the weapon could have been. The police quickly developed a suspect. It was an acquaintance of Juliette's, 50-year-old Gregory Mark Riviera. He was seen at a bar with Juliette on the last night she was seen alive. The police had questioned him while Juliette was missing. After she was found dead, the police noticed some inconsistencies in his statements. They got an arrest warrant and went to his apartment. But when they got inside, they found it was abandoned. Riviera was nowhere to be found. In 1993, America's Most Wanted featured Riviera on an episode, but it did not lead to an arrest. The case was ultimately cold until May 2022. In those 30 years, a lot had changed. Popular movies released in 1992 include A League of Their Own, Aladdin, and Unforgiven. In 2022, some popular movies were Everything Everywhere All at Once, Nope, and The Batman. Popular TV series that debuted in 1992 were Melrose Place, Dateline, and MTV's The Real World. 2022 saw the debuts of Peacemaker, Murderville, and Bel Air, which is a reimagined version of a show that was popular in 1992, Fresh Prince of Bel Air. In 1992, the three biggest songs of the year were End of the Road by Boyz II Men, Baby Got Back by Sir Mix-a-Lot, and Jump by Criss Cross. In 2022, they were Heat Waves by Glass Animals, As It Was by Harry Styles, and Stay by The Kid Laroi and Justin Bieber. In May 2022, the police got a call from the coroner's office in Merced County, California. Earlier that year, on January 29, 2022, a transient, only known as John Paul, had died of natural causes. The man did not have any identification on him. They needed to notify the next of kin, so they took his fingerprints and put it into the state's fingerprint database. They were surprised to find out that he was a wanted fugitive. John Paul was Gregory Mark Rivera. The police investigated, and they learned that Gregory Mark had a brother, John Paul. The police talked to John Paul's daughter and learned that he had medical problems, but he was alive. She told the police that her father and her uncle would swap identities to avoid problems with law enforcement. The police never said what problems the real John Paul had with the law. After discovering that Gregory Mark was dead, the police said that after 30 years, the murder of Juliette Rivera was now closed. Our second case takes us to February 1981. On February 24, 1981, 32-year-old Prince Charles and 19-year-old Diana Spencer announced that they were engaged to be married. The couple met in November 1977 when Diana was 16. At the time, Charles was dating Diana's sister. Charles and Diana started dating in the summer of 1980. They were engaged for about 5 months and then married in July 1981. Less than a year later, in June 1982, Diana gave birth to the couple's first son, William. This was followed by the birth of their second son, Harry, in September 1984. In 1986, Charles began an extramarital affair with Carmela Parker Bowles, a woman whom he had dated in the early 1970s. In December 1992, Charles and Diana split up after 11.5 years of marriage. In August 1996, their divorce was finalized. Tragically, a year later, Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris, France. She was 36 years old. 9 years later, in April 2005, Prince Charles married Carmilla, and they are still together at the time of this recording. Charles became king in September 2022. On February 7, 1981, the #1 song was Celebration by Kool and the Gang. The #1 movie was the controversial police drama Fort Apache, The Bronx, starring Paul Newman. Many people who lived in the Bronx, New York, were upset with the film's depiction of the Bronx as a crime-ridden wasteland. It's believed that the controversy helped make the film a success at the box office. On the night of February 7, 1981, Ray Richard Clark, who went by Joe, was at home in Marietta, Ohio. Marietta was the first permanent settlement in the Northwest Territory. It was founded in 1788, about 15 years before Ohio became a state. The name is to honor French Queen Marie Antoinette. Joe Clark was the chief deputy sheriff of Washington County, where Marietta is located. He had been with the sheriff's department for about 11 years. He was a drug awareness officer. He went to area schools and talked to children about the dangers of drugs. Joe was married, and he and his wife Patricia had a son. Joe was also a stepfather to Patricia's daughter from another relationship. On the afternoon of February 7, 1981, Joe finished his shift at the department. He went to a store and bought a Guns and Ammo magazine. He then went home. Joe was a big fan of the Ohio State University basketball team. That evening, they were playing Michigan State University. He was watching the game on television, reading his magazine, drinking a beer, and having some cheese and crackers with his wife. At about 8:30 p.m., he got up and went into the kitchen to get more cheese. Suddenly, Patricia heard an explosion and the light in the kitchen went out. She went into the kitchen and found her 49-year-old husband on the floor. She initially thought he had electrocuted himself. She got to the phone and called for help. When first responders arrived, 49-year-old Joe Clark was dead. It was determined he was shot with the number 4 buckshot from a 12-gauge shotgun. The shooter was outside and shot through a window. The buckshot hit Joe in the head, neck, and chest. One of the few pieces of evidence the police found was a spent shotgun shell. They also found a boot print in the snow. It was made with a military combat boot. After the shooting, several people came forward and said that they saw a young white man with long blonde hair near the Clark's home around the time of the shooting. A sketch artist created 10 different sketches of the man, and they were all made public. Witnesses also said that they saw a blue Ford Pinto parked near the crime scene around the time of the murder. It was idling, and there was a man inside of it. One driver noted that the driver looked suspicious. As the person drove by, he tried to hide his face with his hand. One person said that seconds after driving by the car, he heard a gunshot. The car was parked close to the crime scene, but there was no way the man in the car could have run from the vehicle and fired the shot in the amount of time that the man saw the car and then heard the gunshot. So the police concluded that 2 men were involved in the murder. One was the shooter, and the second drove the getaway car. However, no arrests were made. The police thought the most logical explanation regarding motive was that it was drug-related. 2 days before Joe was killed, he talked to a reporter and told them that the following week he was going to make arrests and identify people involved in the local drug trade. The day he was killed, the article with his statements was published. The police investigated the drug angle, and the lead investigator started to receive death threats. Things got to be so bad that he moved his family out of the county, and he slept in a jail cell with a shotgun and a pistol. While there were a few persons of interest in the case, no arrests were made, and the case went cold. Decades went by, and it became the oldest unsolved murder of a law enforcement agent in the United States. Then, in November 2012, 31 years after Joe Clark's murder, the Washington County Sheriff's Department opened a cold case unit. Much had changed in those 31 years. The best-selling albums in 1981 were Greatest Hits 1 by Queen, Face Value by Phil Collins, and Business as Usual by Men at Work. Popular video games released in 1981 were Donkey Kong, Frogger, and Tempest. In 2012, major video games that were released were New Super Mario Bros. 2, Far Cry 3, and Call of Duty Black Ops 2. In 1981, new foods that were introduced were I Can't Believe It's Not Butter, the McRib, and Prego pasta sauce. In 2012, you could eat Crave cereal, Taco Bell's Rio Locos Tacos, and Burger King's Angry Whopper. When the cold case unit was launched in November 2012, one of the first cases they looked at was the murder of one of their own, Joe Clark. The case file was huge. There were over 18,000 pages for the cold case investigators to pore over. When they re-examined the case, they got the sense it was not a drug killing. The killer seemed organized and methodical. Notably, he stood outside waiting for Joe to get into position to kill him. They thought the killer might have a military background. The cold case investigators did some ballistic testing. They knew the murder weapon was a 12-gauge shotgun and the ammo that was used was 4-buck. In a 4-buck shot, there are generally 21 to 24 pellets. The investigators believe the shot was fired from about 31 feet from the window. A shotgun with a shorter barrel leads to more spray with a buckshot. But Joe Clark was shot with a high concentration of pellets that went through a window. The police did not find many pellets outside the window. Ballistic testing suggested that the barrel of the murder weapon was about 18 inches long. People in law enforcement commonly use this type of gun. The investigators then shifted their investigation. They believed that Joe was not killed by people involved in the drug trade, but rather by one of his own fellow officers. So they started looking for someone who had been on the force who had a grudge against Joe. It turned out that a few months before Joe was murdered, he conducted an investigation that led to a sheriff's deputy, Mitchell Rubel, being fired. Rubel had arrested a man for breaking and entering. While driving the man to the police station, he kept saying he was innocent. So Rubel drove him to an isolated area. He punched the man several times and put a gun to his head. He told him to confess or he'd kill him. The man filed a complaint against Rubel. Joe investigated the claim and concluded that Rubel should be relieved of his duties as a sheriff's deputy. Rubel was dismissed a short time later. The cold case detectives investigated Rubel and learned he served in the Army and the Air Force. He was a Vietnam vet. Also, at the time of the murder, Rubel's wife owned a blue Ford Pinto. The police interviewed people who knew Rubel, and they said he was very angry at Joe for losing his job. On the weekend of the murder, Rubel was having an extramarital affair. Cold case investigators talked to his mistress, and she remembered something odd that happened on the weekend of the murder. She had seen Joe Clark speak at a community event and was impressed with him. She told Rubel this, and he became infuriated and said that Joe would be better off dead. Rubel then left the hotel room where they were staying, got into a blue Pinto, and drove away. After reopening the case, the cold case investigators located Mitchell Rubel and questioned him. He said he had an alibi for the night of the murder. He said he had a friend named Bob Smithberger and he was with him that night. The police interviewed Smithberger and he was hesitant to talk. So they offered him police protection. Smithberger then broke down and told the police what happened that night. He said that Rubel came to his home and asked for a shotgun. He then told him to drive to Joe's house because he was going to kill him. Smithberger said he went along, but he thought that Rubel was kidding. When they got close to Joe's house, he parked the car and Rubel left with a shotgun. Smithberger said that after the shooting, Rubel threatened to kill him if he told anyone that he killed Joe. The police then needed physical evidence, and they thought the best they would get was the murder weapon. Smithberger told the police that Rubel had sold it to a man who served with him in the Air Force. It turned out that annually, Rubel's Air Force buddies met up. The police photographed the men, and then, using facial recognition technology, they determined all their identities. The police talked to the men, and one said he purchased a shotgun from Rubel. He still had it, and he gave it to the police. Ballistic testing determined it was the murder weapon. In September 2014, 63-year-old Mitchell Rubel was arrested for Joe Clark's murder, which happened 33 years prior. Rubel, who was married and had 4 children and 5 grandchildren, denied killing Joe. Mitchell Rubel went to trial in October 2015, and it ended with a hung jury. The jury was evenly split 6-6. Rubel went to trial again in March 2016. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury deliberated for 8 hours. Mitchell Rubel was found guilty of aggravated murder. In April 2016, he was sentenced to 15 years to life. Mitchell Rubel died in prison less than a year later on February 18, 2017, 11 days after the 36th anniversary of the murder of Joe Clark. Rubel was 66 years old. For our last case, we're going back to May 1988. On May 15, 1988, after nearly 9 years of fighting, the Soviet Union started to completely pull out their troops from Afghanistan. There were several reasons why the Soviet Union chose to invade Afghanistan, which was on their southern border. This included Afghanistan being a strategic geopolitical spot, the Soviets having problems establishing relations with the Afghan government, and there was turmoil in the country, and the Soviets were worried that their Cold War adversaries, the Americans, might get involved in Afghanistan, and then they would become their ally. So on December 23, 1989, the Soviets invaded, and within days, they killed the Afghan president and his ministers, and installed their own puppet government. This led to a civil war between the Soviet-controlled Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and the Afghan Mujahideen and their allied foreign fighters. During the nearly 9-year war, over 1 million civilians and nearly 1,000 combatants were killed. The war was settled in April 1988 after prolonged negotiations. On May 15, 1988, the Soviets started to pull their troops out. By February 1989, all their troops were out of the country. The failure in Afghanistan was a major problem for the struggling USSR. It was an even bigger problem for Afghanistan, which was left in ruins, and there was a power vacuum. In 1996, the Taliban staged a coup and took over the country. They allowed Osama bin Laden to establish a base in Afghanistan for his group, Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden fought in Afghanistan against the Soviets during the war. 5 years later, on September 11, 2001, following bin Laden's plan, 2 passenger planes flew into the World Trade Center towers, killing 2,996 people, including the 19 hijackers. Less than a month later, the United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan, and the Taliban government was overthrown. The Americans started their withdrawal from Afghanistan over 18 years later, in February 2020. On May 21, 1988, the #1 song was Anything for You by Gloria Estefan and the Miami Sound Machine. The #1 movie was the fantasy film Willow, directed by Ron Howard. In May 1988, the Mitchell family lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana. They had lived in the same neighborhood for about 10 years, and they were well liked. Larry and Sandra Mitchell, both 37, had 3 sons together, 11-year-old Jermaine, 5-year-old Genayle, and 3-year-old Durell. Also living with them was Sandra's 16-year-old son, Cortell Watson, who was from a different relationship. Larry worked at an axle, dry shaft, and transmission supply company. Shortly after 4 a.m., an intense fire broke out in the family's 2-story home. Sandra and 16-year-old Cortell jumped out of second-story windows. Larry was forced out through a window onto the porch roof, and that's where firefighters found him when they arrived. He was trying to make his way back inside to save his 3 boys. But the smoke was too intense and he could not get back inside. The firefighters had him jump down to the ground. The firefighters made it inside and found the dead bodies of 11-year-old Jermaine, 5-year-old Genayle, and 3-year-old Durell in their beds. It was later determined they had died of smoke inhalation. Larry, Sandra, and Cortell were taken to the hospital. Larry had suffered smoke inhalation, but he was in fair condition. Cortell was injured by flying broken glass, and he was also in fair condition. Sandra was in serious condition. She had suffered smoke inhalation, and one of her arms was badly burned. She survived, but she needed skin grafts to repair her arm. There was an investigation, and it was determined that the fire was an act of arson. A Molotov cocktail was thrown through the window of their living room. The police investigated, but no arrests were made. In 1988, Fort Wayne had a population of about 172,000 people. The blaze was not only shocking because 3 young boys were killed, but also because it was the second deadly arson fire in a month. Like the Mitchells, the Weidenhoff family lived in a 2-story house in Fort Wayne. 25-year-old Edgar Weidenhoff was a mechanic. His 23-year-old wife, Lori, had worked as a waitress, but had recently quit to take care of their 2 children, 4-year-old Amber and 19-month-old Christopher. The fire department was called to the family's home at 2:47 a.m. on May 6, 1988. The only family member who got out of the house on their own was Lori. She crawled out of a 2nd-story window onto an awning, but the awning gave way and she fell onto a chain-link fence. The firefighters found Edgar and Christopher in a downstairs bedroom. 4-year-old Amber was in an upstairs bedroom. All 4 family members were taken to the hospital. Only Lori was in stable condition. Amber was badly burned, and tragically, the 4-year-old died a day later. 3 days later, 19-month-old Christopher died from smoke inhalation. Edgar and Lori both survived. The police believe that someone burglarized their house and then set it on fire on their way out of the home. However, the police did not say that the 2 deadly arsons where children were killed were connected. It was not long before both cases went cold. After the fire, Larry and Sandra Mitchell stayed together. In 2001, Larry retired from his job at the supplies company. He later started working at a fast food restaurant for something to do. Then, in the autumn of 2019, Sandra was terminally ill. She told Larry, quote, "I'm going home to see my boys," unquote. Sandra Mitchell died on November 27, 2019, at age 69. Larry continued to live in Fort Wayne. He would visit the property where his sons died. Nothing was built on the property after the remnants of the house were taken away. He said that one of the neighbors sometimes heard children laughing on the property even though no one was there. In December 2021, Larry went to the police and asked them to reopen the investigation. Larry said that people encouraged him to talk to the police. They did not want to see another anniversary pass without the case being solved. In May 2022, it would have been the 34th anniversary of the deaths of his 3 sons. A detective agreed to reopen the case. A lot had changed in the 33.5 years since the deadly blaze. In 1988, popular movies that were released were Big, Heathers, and Coming to America. Encanto, Don't Look Up, and the sequel to Coming to America were all released in 2021. 1988 saw the debut of the television shows 48 Hours, The Wonder Years, and Murphy Brown. In 2021, Abbott Elementary, Loki, and The White Lotus all debuted. Margaret Atwood's Cat's Eye, Michael Blake's Dances with Wolves, and James Ellroy's The Big Nowhere were all published in 1988. In 2021, Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary, The Push by Ashley Audrain, and The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix were all published. The detective examined all the evidence and re-interviewed witnesses who were more open to talking after 3 decades. One of the early suspects in the case was 19-year-old Jarvis Jefferson, who also went by Rohi Israel. Jefferson told a relative that he was the one who threw the Molotov cocktail through the family's window. Other evidence and statements further proved that Jefferson was the arsonist. However, it was too late to charge Jefferson with anything. He died of a drug overdose on December 28, 2020, about a year before Larry Mitchell asked the police to reopen the case. He was 53 years old. In January 2022, the police announced that they were closing the case. They were confident that Jarvis Jefferson killed 11-year-old Jermaine, 5-year-old Genayle, and 3-year-old Durell. The police never said why Jefferson was an early suspect in the case. Also, if they determined a motive, they did not make that public. Larry said he knew Jefferson when he was a child, and he also knew his parents. He did not know that he was a suspect in the case. Larry talked to the press, and he said that people told him he was alive for a reason, which was to get the murders of his son solved. The city of Fort Wayne now owns the property where the deadly blaze happened. It's a vacant lot with a sign indicating it's a memorial site to the 3 boys. Larry wants to buy the property back and make it a park where children can play. As for the other deadly arson fire that killed 4-year-old Amber and 19-year-old Christopher Weidenhoff, it has never been solved. The police did not mention that case when they announced the murders of Jermaine, Genayle, and Durell were solved, so it's not believed that the 2 fires are connected. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. If you have any cases you want to suggest for Into the Killing, Criminally Listed, or Paranormally Listed, please visit our website, criminallylisted.com. Then go to the Suggest a Case page. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Please take care of yourself and stay safe.